Dun, dun, dun. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome down the security rabbit hole to yet another edition of the Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. This is Raph. I welcome you back with my co-host, Mr. James. How are you, bud?
I'm doing well. And, judging by the pre-conversation for this sounds like it's going to be a good time. I'm
Yeah,
not
well, yeah.
really sure what the topic is at this point, but I'm looking forward to finding out.
I think we should just stick with the conversation we had going before. We were talking about like cool shows we're binging, and we've covered the everything from serial killers to Yellowstone and and Ted Lasso and all sorts of things in between. So it's and the new Mel Brooks sketch. So yeah, it's going to be awesome. On this episode, we're going to talk about some government stuff. I know you guys are all fans that are listening. Anytime the government sets forth policy that dictates our lives and our cybers, I'm very excited about it. You can tell in my voice how excited I am. And bringing back for, I don't know, Brian, what time is this for you? Like third, fourth, 19th? I've lost track.
This
Brian
is
Chittister, how are you, man?
good, man. This is number 3, I think, and I will tell you. So I've had my podcast now, Ralph, for 3 years, and
Yeah.
you were the first ever podcast I did. So I'm excited to pull this back, man.
All right, look at that. We come back full circle.
Oh yeah.
All right, and in the bottom left hand corner, right there, Jordan, how are you, man?
Doing well, Raph. Appreciate you and James having me on the conversation today.
Tell the people a little about yourself and who you are and where you hail from.
Yeah, so I mean, you can say that I'm a government nerd. I spent a bit of time working in the government previously in the White House Office of the Federal CIO. I was chief of staff there, breaking a lot of stuff, but really working on orchestrating a lot of IT and cyber policy. And now today, I have the pleasure of working at Secure. We're an identity verification and fraud risk management company. I lead their public sector strategy overall to basically help with solving some of the problems I couldn't fix while I was on the other side.
Nice. And today is hoodie day. I'm sorry you didn't get the memo, Jordan.
I know, I completely missed it. I'm gonna have to do better about this. I thought I had it ready, but no, clearly.
James and I got
stars
the
were
gray
not
hoodies.
aligned.
Brian's got the blue.
I'll
Man,
slack you next time,
practically
Jordan.
got a hoodie.
Hey,
There you
man,
go.
he might have one of those collars that unzips and a hood pops out. Like, we don't know.
If only I'm wearing the old man dad fleece jacket or silk jacket or whatever. I feel like I need to go out in the tracksuit with my Crocs or something like that.
Oh man, if you've got a tracksuit, that's really dad in it. Like that's rocking right there, baby.
That's either
Oh,
dad or
yeah.
mafia. It's one of the two.
That's
Oh,
right. That's right. You're either
Combination of
going to
both.
your kid's soccer match, or you're gonna go. You're gonna go drink vodka in the back room and talk about
collect payments.
That's right. Collect payments.
Why not do both?
He has once worked for the government. All right, moving on. Brian's like, what the hell are we doing here? But we digress. All right. So I'm gonna put this on a tee for you guys, and I'll let the two of you kind of rock out with this one. But where do you suppose we are at the moment with the new regs that are there that came out, the guidance, I guess. What is it telling us? What's of interest? Wherever you want to start, I'll leave that to you.
I'm gonna let Jordan take this first question because he was actually one of the guys that has helped shape, inform some of the things that are now coming out. So if you were gonna have anybody talk about this, he's the man. So go for it, Jordan.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I mean, I guess we'll start off with saying that everyone should be prepared to get chipped at the end of the day. Kidding. No, what's come out recently in the last week has been an update to the National Cybersecurity Strategy, which provides, if you will, a framing of what is the top priorities for the country as it relates to cybersecurity and the work we're doing there. And then also the president unveiled or previewed what is, if you will, a blueprint for how he wants to tackle what we saw in the uptick of fraud that took place over the last couple of years. Much of this has been previewed since the 2002 State of the Union. I think it was the first time he made mention of work that he wanted to do in this space related to an executive order. And so both documents decided to drop late last week. or a little over a couple weeks ago, rather. And since then, all of us government nerds have been kind of swirling about what they all mean. I think it means a couple of different things. Right? If we look for the cybersecurity lens, the administration is looking really to turn the regulatory apparatus on its head and reframe what incentives look like for private industry and try to shift some of that pain, if you will, from the consumer back to companies. And then if you look for the preview of what they're doing from the funding standpoint, really it's about a lot of investment that they're looking for Congress to make. We'll see what happens in the coming months on that. But it's signaling what are priorities or gaps that they know that they have, a lot related to fraud prevention, measurement, transparency, and just broader efforts to improve equity overall for government benefits. That's about as summed up as I can before we start putting people to sleep.
Yeah. Okay. So it's long. It's like 40 pages, 45 pages, something like that.
Oh yeah, it's a nice little page turner.
Government doesn't do anything short, Raf.
Also true.
Comprehensive.
All right. Sure. We can do that. What do you think is like, okay, so one, I skimmed it and it's been a week and we've had some interesting banking developments since then. So my reading and attention has been turned elsewhere as Silicon Valley slowly implodes. Did I say slowly? I meant rapidly.
Yeah, 48 hours. Let's do this.
48 hours, Silicon Valley unwinds into the Dust Bowl. Bye-bye. But so from what I can recall, there's a lot of lofty goals in there and a lot of good ideas. But I always, like I always said, like the road to hell is paved with good ideas. It's not good intentions, it's good ideas that don't get executed. Is this something that we can actually execute on? That's something that we can actually do, or is this just more of like more really nice, like, oh, it'd be great if kind of stuff?
I would say it's a combination of things on that front, right? There's certain pieces where you're going to need a broader collaboration. I would say the things that we're able to execute on, the administration's regulatory agenda, what they want to do for setting stricter regulations, that's something that they basically signaled for the last couple of years. If you go back to when the SolarWinds hack occurred, there was kind of that recognition, and I was in government at the time, that what we had in place did not incentivize the right types of behavior, I would say, from a cybersecurity standpoint at all company levels. And so the only way to really change the inflection point of where priorities was to go apply stricter regulations. So I actually think it's well within the administration's ability to put out a robust regulatory agenda. I think they've signaled that is the goal. They're going to execute on it. And so we should probably expect to see that within the coming weeks and months about what they intend to do there. And again, much of this has been previewed for the last couple of years now. When it comes to things like public and private partnerships, some of those are already existing. I think it's really about strengthening and bolstering what we do in that space. And then if we look at the pieces that call for broader investment, looks towards innovation, those are the ones I'm going to say are more of those lofty goals. And it's about how much collaboration we can spur across two parts of government, being the legislative branch and the executive branch, in order to accomplish those goals, right? So the president and his team have effectively set out their vision, what they want to accomplish, and it's really going to be on Congress to be able to execute, working with them. So they have to do this next dance, this next part in partnership. And as I've seen from many presidents' budgets, we're going to have a wonderful conversation in the next few months about where we end up as a government, and more importantly, what are the things we're going to prioritize.
Yeah, I was gonna say over the next couple of months, let's make sure you don't default, and then let's work on. Let's worry about what happens after that, because the National Lampoon branch currently is I think this is both like, hey, we're not gonna let you pay the credit card bill because you're irresponsible, and the other one's like, oh yeah, well I bet I can go spend more. Anyway, not to get into that, but so the approach is laid out in essentially 4 or 5 steps. So defend critical infrastructure, and we'll break these down. Defend critical infrastructure, disrupt and dismantle threat actors, shape market forces to drive security and resilience, the shape is interesting. I want to talk about that. Invest in a resilient future. Okay, that's interesting. And forge international partnerships to pursue shared goals. That one very much interests me because that sounds like we're going to make friends and go chase bad guys. But let's start with defend critical. Why can't I talk? Defend critical infrastructure. Expanding the use of minimum cybersecurity requirements in critical sectors to ensure national cybersecurity and policy safety, and harmonizing regulations to reduce the burden of compliance. Really? We're going to reduce the burden of compliance. Okay, tell me more. Anyone?
Yeah, and so I think it starts off really with understanding of like for the U.S. and again, this is the nerd in me. There's 16 critical infrastructures encompassing everything from our transportation systems, chemical, government as it exists today, financial services, water, defense, industrial base, so on and so forth. I think the reality here is that today, as it exists, there's only a few of those sectors that really prioritize cybersecurity protections in particular. Paramount to that, you would assume government is one of them. And I actually think financial services is definitely one of the more forward-leaning of those that are out there. The other sectors, not to say that they are not doing things related to cybersecurity, they just, I would say, have not prioritized it because their focus has been innately on mission. And there's really there's been this misalignment to say that unfortunately when you try to prioritize cybersecurity, you're not being able to focus on the mission in particular, when in the reality is that if you pick a nation state and they hack or interrupt your core business, the sector is impacted. You're not able to do something. If for an example, China or Russia impacted the systems that control our water in particular, now we have a crisis where folks are unable, even more so than what we have, based on our existing infrastructure, that we now have a crisis cause where folks are, the chlorine mix, for an example, that's used in water treatment facilities would be too high and make it undrinkable and unsafe.
Yeah, it was a real thing.
So like that, yeah, that is an example of like how this can go wrong and why kind of the U.S. has wanted to place increased focus on protecting these sectors, because they are kind of the lifeblood, if you will, for America and how it continues to operate.
So, Brian, maybe you can comment on this, because I think you and I have had this conversation. But one of the bullet points under that is enabling public-private collaboration at the speed and scale necessary to defend critical infrastructure and essential services. That whole public-private collaboration, like that has been a drumbeat for 2-3 presidents now, maybe more. Like InfraGard became the standard bearer for that. And I really wanted to like have InfraGard be something awesome. And for the first long time that I was part of it, it was a one-way conversation. And I think it's finally started to be something a little bit better, but it's still super clunky in a lot of cases. It's not to say that that's easy, right? It's not an easy partnership to do, but the whole idea of public-private partnerships sounds really aspirational, but it's hard to execute properly because of all the different TLPs, right? All the different colors that you can have in terms of, what can you share, what can you not share, who's in the circle of trust, who's not, who's need to know. How do we is there a better way to navigate that than what we've been doing?
So first of all, before I jump into that question, I just want to say, I mean, people hear kind of federal guidance or executive orders from the federal government. Something to keep in mind is that these have ramifications at the state level, local level too, right? The federal government takes a look at the critical infrastructures that need support, and there's trickle down money to make sure those pieces are supported. So anybody listening who's thinking, okay, this is just a federal thing, it might not impact me as directly, I think it very much impacts people directly. And I think that's the beauty of it, is because the federal government understands not only do they have the capability, but they have the responsibility to kind of support and bolster at the state level, right? To help people directly, like citizens like you and me on an everyday basis. So I think that's just something to think about. On the public-private partnership basis, one of the things that at least I've been seeing from the outside looking in, I mean, Jordan's had an inside look. So Jordan, I'd love your take here too, but it's gotten so much better than what it was decades ago, right? I think for a long time, government, and this is, I'm going to break out my first sports analogy. For a long time, government's really given the private sector the Heisman, right? Because private sector comes in and they have dollar signs, right? These massive government contracts, and I'm going to sell these things and we're going to make so much money. And I think because of that, the government's had to become even more risk averse, say, hey, well, I need to protect and make sure that what we're buying is actually driving outcomes. Go figure, right? Everything the commercial sector does on a daily basis. And now the private sector's thinking, okay, well, we really have to drive an impact then. We can't just sell things, do this waterfall thing where 3 years later, the program might deploy and it might get outcomes, so on and so forth. So we've gotten, I think, leaders into government into some really innovative situations where they want to lean on private sector and they're looking for true government partners. And I think that is where you've seen these private sector partnerships with government really blossoming. So to answer your question, sure. Of course it can be better. I think it can always be better, but it's gotten so much better than what it was. And I think part of that too is some of the smaller companies and more emerging technology companies understanding how to work with government. There's been great groups out there like Decode, Megan Metzger over at Decode, have worked with some emerging tech companies to help them understand, working with the Silicon Valley companies we were just talking about. They understand not only how government works, and Jordan can probably speak for hours around some of the bureaucracy and why it's necessary, but it's there, but understanding how to navigate that bureaucracy and really drive outcomes with that public mission in mind. So I think that's really changed the game. So now government can look and say, you know what, before all we could do was lean on the IBMs of the world or whomever who we feel like, okay, they have the scale to support. And now they can lean on everybody and anybody who wants to drive the mission of government forward. And I think that's been a complete game changer for these type of partnerships.
Yeah, Brian, I think he hit the nail on the head, right? Like there's definitely was this, perspective that you had to be an insider. You had to be one of the kind of trusted contractors to really know what was going on. And in reality, with how quickly things are moving, how quickly things are evolving, that is not sustainable. It's not scalable. And so in a number of cases, even today, right, there's a lot of outreach that takes place to the private sector, a lot of sitting down. And once you understand that it's not just about selling, it's about solving a problem, there's a lot of partnership that takes place naturally to look at what can be done to get ahead of where we are today, knowing that, we're having to not only protect what's going on in the American public, but then also withstand what's happening from, adversarial threats that we see coming from other countries.
One last point on this first one, because I do want to get through all four of these before the hour mark. The point of defending and modernizing federal networks and updating federal incident response policy. The incident response policy is one thing, but defending and modernizing federal networks. There was a report, or I think OMB put it out quite a while ago, about how far behind some of these federal important level networks infrastructure is in terms of technology. This feels to me like a technology overhaul, like a generational ask. I hate saying this, but how do we do that without a massive budget here and a superhuman effort in a time where it's not so easy to find the talent?
Let me just jump in here real quick, because I just had this conversation with Don Yeski, he's the acting chief technology officer now for the U.S. Navy, just assumed the role like a month or so ago. And we talked about more of the appetite for change. So you talk about there being this massive budget necessitated. I think one of the things you have to think about, though, is a lot of these agencies and departments have been on this track for a while. So it's not just this moment in time and all of a sudden we're going to flip the coin over and everybody's going to be modernized. It's a process. That's one. But I think part of what you're seeing too is putting people in place, leadership in place that has the appetite for change. We've had people for so long that have been, I mean, the best analogy I can make is just kind of kicking the can down the road, right?
Sure.
They're in a leadership position. They don't want to rock the boat. They want to keep everything kind of homeostasis, for lack of a better word. And now you have some leaders in place that have an appetite for change. And it's not because they're looking to rock the boat, but it's because they look and say, you know what? I see this problem. I see we're headed. This train's not gonna make it to its destination. There's something I have to do. I have a responsibility to do this. And I think that's part of what you're seeing now. Now, a lot of these departments have been on this process for a long period of time. So I don't think you're going to have to throw billions and billions of dollars at the problem, but it's definitely going to take some upheaval and some strategy, but it's more of a mindset change than I think of anything else. I think that's the biggest thing that's needed at that to make that switch possible.
The awkward silence that comes. No.
Yeah, sorry, I put myself on mute. I said, Jordan, any thoughts on that?
Look, tons. Especially having lived in the bureaucracy for a bit. What I would say is that there's so a lot of what Brian said is right. Like that's there has to be a lot of shifting mindset. I think there's also kind of the unspoken thing of there's a lot of priorities that our agencies have, a lot of things that they get told to do. And the thing that slows down progress the most is having to do too much with what are limited staff and resources. Like we'll ask them, for an example, I'm going to pick up what happened during the pandemic. We'll ask them to stand up a whole new program using infrastructure that doesn't exist. And oh, by the way, get it out in 2 weeks while keeping everything else that they were doing running versus taking a pause, what other companies would do, right? Like if I'm looking at commercial sector, it's you can't do everything. It's we're going to take a strategic pause. We're going to do the things we can do and then get back to it. Government doesn't have that luxury ultimately. And so what you end up doing is everything slowly. And I think that, one of the things that plays into the modernization journey, because it is a journey, it's a continuous one, is kind of that better need for understanding what those incentives are, better need for helping to balance that prioritization, and then getting kind of that coalition of the willing. So you may have a champion that wants to do it, wants to go fight the uphill battle, but it has to work with everyone in the organization to move the whole thing forward, right? There's no one that can do it this individually in government, and it's really about building coalitions. It's actually one of the things that they evaluate senior executives for in government before they take the job. It's their ability to lead change and manage coalitions, because they recognize that it is kind of vital to how they operate going forward.
That works inside the government where they have that going. How does that work when you talk about like the critical infrastructure segments and stuff like that? Like you go into the water treatment areas, you're going to these other places, you still have to drive change. You still have to, I can't just throw money at it and say, here's a bunch of money, go make it happen, right? Because there's still a lot of stuff that happens behind that scenes. And, obviously incentives, although I'm not sure what incentives mean here, because I feel like incentives are referring to liability, but usually incentives are more of like a, hey, you do this and you'll get this positive outlook from this versus a don't do this and here's your incentive. How do you sit there and drive that change from the government sitting there looking at it and saying, hey, internally, we know we can start doing this stuff and we've been slowly righting this ship. Now let's go push this upon these other segments and hope that they're willing to do the same thing, but they're potentially years behind on that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that they created with a lot of their legislation or executive orders related to critical infrastructure, they have these sector risk management agencies. See, I also can't speak, but basically they're the ones who are responsible for providing kind of that broader oversight or engagement with the sector overall. They can set policies and kind of the regulatory approaches that are used to drive progress. And if you think about, and no one likes to be audited, no one likes regulations in particular, but they are a great driver for making change happen in particular. And so, I mean, the number one thing that spurs folks to act is compliance, whether we like it or not. It's kind of the reality there. It's a question of how do you overuse it, or do you make sure that folks are understanding kind of what the outcome is associated with it beforehand. But I think that, the SRMAs, or sector risk management agencies, they have the ability to drive a lot of that conversation. And look, the reality is that even for some of those sectors that kind of aren't really paying attention to the regulatory apparatus, there's going to have to be a lot of, I'm going to say, education of understanding what goes wrong and making sure that it kind of aligns for everyone in terms of principles. Pick on transportation. If something happens to our railways in particular, right, they're largely interconnected through technology today, or that's the backbone of them. Something happens and we can't run railways. What does that do for the passengers? What does that do for the experience? What does that do for profitability for some of those companies that are supporting it? I think all of those things are what ends up driving, will ultimately end up driving progress in the space. But it's one of those things where you have to have kind of a continued focus over a longer time horizon. None of this is going to be quick, and it's one of those things where everyone working in federal government today, or those who will come into the federal government later, working with those sectors, are all going to be part of that ongoing journey.
So, all right, that's fair. Disrupt and dismantle threat actors is an interesting one. Strategically employing all tools and national power to disrupt adversaries. I feel like we've been doing that already. Engage the private sector, disrupt activities through scalable mechanisms. That's more that public-private partnership. This one's interesting. Addressing the ransomware threat through a comprehensive federal approach and in lockstep with our international partners. This is the first time I've seen a ransomware called out like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think
It's
it's something.
interesting.
Yeah, it's something that when you looked at what happened over the pandemic, I mean, it was incredibly pervasive because people could be so opportunistic, right? You had people that relied so heavily on government services, and to that effect, that they had no choice but to kind of comply, right? To be able to provide these services back out. Now, the government is saying we need to go on the offensive, I think, and make sure that these type of situations don't happen. I mean, to Jordan's point earlier, government doesn't have, you can call it a luxury, you can call it whatever you want, but government can't let citizens fail, right? They can let other things fail. They can't let citizens fail, because it's, at the end of the day, it's literally their life and death situation. And ransomware is a major problem when it comes to getting the services that are needed. I mean, think of like SNAP benefits, right? That could be a matter of whether a family eats or not. I mean, it's those type of situations. So for them to take a look at this and say, we're going to put our foot down and not allow it, I think it shows the proactive nature in which they want to attack this instead of just react. And I think, again, going back, and it's going to be a common thread throughout this entire thing, what you're really seeing in this guidance, in this type of pre-legislation, is a change in mindset, which is, I think, the biggest pattern that you've seen across government over the past few years.
Yeah, and I would say that, like, if you look at like where ransomware is coming up, right? So there's kind of the reality, like, folks don't like to talk about it externally because it's a big PR nightmare, in particular. But even very recently, there was, I would say, Russia-based attackers who impacted like a part of a healthcare system. They set a fee for them to pay. The healthcare system did not, and so their result was to release the patient's data and pictures of cancer patients and whatnot out publicly, or the dark web in particular. So basically, from a privacy standpoint, completely eliminate what the privacy safeguards were for the individuals who were receiving like radiation treatment or other pieces or other types of treatments in particular. And so, like, we've also entered this kind of realm where it's no longer even about just getting the money. It's also now impacting kind of privacy and civil liberties for folks, depending on whether or not they meet the demands of those who are conducting the ransomware or engaging it in particular. So it's becoming more of a critical issue, and I'm glad to see the administration say something about it, instead of kind of letting it kind of be the silent thing that's happening, where folks aren't really talking about externally.
Well,
I think ransomware. I was going to say, I think ransomware. What's interesting about it is it's been around for a long time, but which has given us the opportunity to collect enough data about that to actually see like what are the real risks, not the theoretical. Everybody thinks this could happen. Like, what have we actually seen happen with this? And tack on the way that they're changing it, that it's no longer we're just locking up files, but we're actually taking the data as well. Like the way that it's matured in what it's doing, and that it's not going away. We thought maybe it would go away, but it didn't ever go away. So being able to call that out directly, really helps, because I mean that's a majority of what you see for most things.
The other thing I want to say is, I mean, it brings us right into that identity conversation, right? Because from a ransomware perspective, if you send kind of disparate pieces of information about people out, you can start to build identity personas in aggregate, right? You take a little information here, a little information here, a little information here, and now you can actually pull together enough information to be able to steal someone's identity. And that becomes obviously a risk and a threat at that point too. So, I mean, there's a lot of factors that play into the ransomware. It's not just specifically to some of the more obvious ones.
Yeah, but I mean, let's be realistic. Everybody in federal government has had their identity given away to the Chinese, like, was it 5-7 whatever years ago? So I'm not sure how much not to be too flippant, but I'm not sure how much that really matters anymore in a realistic sense. Since we've got time for one more, I'm going to drive it because I know where this is going, and I know some of the answer to this. But part 3, driving market forces to shift. Driving market forces, shape market forces to drive security and resilience. Promoting the privacy and security of personal data. I can't wait to see that one executed on, because in a country where everybody gives everything about themselves away, and we talk about preventing spying and such, and we've got the largest Chinese spy operation a la TikTok on everybody's phone. The fact that it's finally been outlawed on federal systems, it feels like so much too little too late. But so that's an interesting point for me. The other one is shifting liability for software products, and all I hear is James S-bomb, bum bum bum, right? Like S-bombs. We're gonna implement S-bombs. Everybody S-bomb, everybody go bomb S-bomb. Jordan, what the hell?
I mean,
let's start with the privacy and security of personal data thing. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, like, look, it's always a goal to protect folks' data, and I hear your point about, because my data has definitely been hacked in 30,000 ways, in particular. But if you think about the younger generation coming up, theirs hasn't necessarily been yet. So if you think about, if you can solve kind of the root cause of why this occurs, poor protections. A lot of it doesn't get leaked from the federal government; it gets leaked from providers, from data aggregators. In particular, if you can somehow fix their incentive structure to get it right, then we can start to cut this down, so it's no longer something that's a pervasive. We're not always getting those letters in the mail that says, hey, your information was included in some breach, so on and so forth, right? It's not coming from the government, it's coming from someone who's contracting with the government, or someone who was doing something commercially. So there's a piece there. There's also kind of the reality of, like, in particular, in some cases we have actually walled off our ability to share data because of kind of the overcorrection related to privacy and how we're sharing information. And so if you're thinking about combating fraud or combating what we're seeing take place from other states, you need data to be shared in order to do it effectively. There is no other way to approach that problem. And unfortunately, when you overcorrect, now you're limiting, you're doing what our adversaries are not doing. You're fighting the battle with one or two hands tied behind your back. And so there's this reality of, like, we must do better to protect it. We must put the right protections in place, not necessarily for everyone who's already been impacted, but for the future. Again, aspirational. But then with that, we need to find a way that we can securely share information, so that way we can create a better experience for folks. We can manage security in the right way there. And I think what the last piece on, or one of the things you were talking about, was shifting kind of the liability. I do not disagree with you in that SBOM is definitely one of the things that are alluded to there, but I think it plays more deeper into secure coding practices, just in particular, right? If you're going to ship a piece of code or ship a feature in particular, and it's going to take you longer to build it right with security in mind from the beginning, or get it out fast. In most cases, companies are going to choose get it out fast. Right now, this is just basically saying you're gonna have to make sure you prioritize the right thing as part of your development lifecycle. I would like to say everyone thinks about security when they're developing code, but let's be real, they're not. It's not even close. And so it really is about making the change of what's needed. And I think Brian said it plenty of times, the mindset, right? And it can't just be government driving the way. It has to be commercial industry, because we're leveraging it not just for the government, but for everything that we're doing as everyday consumers.
It's one of the things too. I mean, Raf, I think one of the last times I was on your show, we talked about, and this was in its very, very early iteration, but the CMMC program, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's just
done spectacularly well, by the way.
I mean, let's be clear. I mean, it has its faults, obviously. I think, but from a mindset perspective, it's the understanding that we're only as strong as our weakest link, right? And I think that was the premise of the program. Now and
by the way, it's awesome in concept, but the fact
correct.
Putting it out there and then fully backpedaling back to nothingville is absolute and total, like caving into the lowest common denominator, and that sucks.
I think Katie's mindset around that, it had good intentions, but I think at the end of the day, obviously execution and the way it worked, we talk about public-private partnerships. I mean, that really kind of blew it out of the water, right? But I think the mindset around taking a look at who our weakest link is and making sure that we shore up everyone, because if there's one that lets it out, all of it goes, right? So it's really bolstering the entire defense industrial base was the premise. And I think it's one of the reasons why I think that type of mindset, that type of view around that, especially in DoD, but also federal civilian, is something that we need to take a deeper look at. Now, again, I don't want to say that program was a success by any stretch of the imagination, but it was a start and a shift in taking a look at pushing the responsibility back onto some of the contractors, which I think needs to be done a little bit more.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say on both of those points, right? The one on the protecting the data, the privacy and all that stuff, right? There's two sides to that's happening. One of those is actually handled by the secure development standpoint of we're not just leaking stuff straight out of our applications, right? So secure development fixes a portion of that. The other side of that then goes to, okay, who are we doing business with and what data are we sending and what do the contracts look like to be able to protect that and say, hey, we have to do business with this. You have to make sure that you're protecting it in a certain way, right? And it's less about the data that's been released, because we can also turn and say everybody's data's out there if you want it. It's more about that trust of, I gave it to you, and the assumption that you're not just handing it out to everybody else, right? So that's really how we look at that. But you look at the secure development side of things, we struggle with doing this because we just accept that every company will have an AppSec team or some security team that's then going to strong arm the development team to do stuff. But the AppSec team has no control, right? We have no power just to say, you should be doing this, and here's the flaws we found, and yet we're still not to a point where we say, hey, wow, we should really require software developers to actually know security for being a software. Like, you're not a software developer unless you actually know the security side of it as well. You can't communicate to a database. You can't do the security stuff. Like, I don't understand, that should be part of what everybody has to know, but we don't do that. And then we require every company to instill their own training program to try to train developers how to do this stuff. Like, listen, I'm not going to hire another developer until I go through the interview process and they can actually answer security questions and they know secure development. Like, we don't push that though, right? So I'd be curious to see when we talk about this whole aspect of, we're really pushing more secure development. Raph, you said the S-bombs, which ain't going to add to secure development anyway. But, what's going to be the push? Another checkbox for secure development training on an annual basis? Like, it's still not going to drive anything outside of
what is the result?
Whatever vendor lobbyist actually push that thing in there because they want their product pushed into every company, right? That's not pushing secure development in the direction we need to push in. We need bigger solutions on that. And, that can start at the federal level too. I mean, they start hiring developers with secure training, like secure development experience. Like, how do we get to that point and say that's a requirement?
And I think that's one of the things that they've been grappling with, which is why their kind of macro idea was liability, right? Like it's one way or another, that is a way to try to incentivize change.
But where's
Now, we'll
the
see how this plays. We'll see how this plays out. But it's one of their, I guess, hypotheses that they're testing, or rolling out to see if that is what finally gives the right stick, if you will, to get folks on the same page about what needs to be done. Everyone knows it needs to be done. It's about changing their perspective.
The question is, where's the liability fall, though, right? Because you got a developer down here writing code. He's not going to be liable. No way they're going to sit there like you got breached. They're going to go back and look and say, oh, this person made this Git change that opened this thing. It got like, you're now on the hook, right? It's not going to happen. Right? It's going to be the organization level still that's going to be falling on this. Like, how does that trickle down to actually? Because what do? We get rid of that developer. We hire another developer that doesn't have any secure development experience.
No, but
the
it's
same
like
cycle.
what happens with it's what happens with contracts today, right? Like, or the other things where liability becomes key. When it rises to the level of attention of the C-suite, then they start basically looking for validation that things have been done, and they start pushing it down. So that, again, that's the theory there. The organization as macro would be the one held liable, but it's in getting the right focus and attention to the CEO, to the CFO, to the operating officer if they have one, right? Beyond just the tech teams. Now you're having a different conversation where everyone is constantly thinking about it, and then it should drive a culture change internally. Again, we're going to see how this plays out as they go to do it and implement it. But it's one of those things. I always used to grapple with what does change perspectives for folks, especially we talk about MFA being the thing that everyone needs to do at a basic level, and then you talk about non-phishable MFA. Well, we're still struggling with people using passwords everywhere, both for consumer convenience, but then also just kind of the reality of it's an easy thing to put in place. What really changes the mindset? Maybe some of this is the start, if you will, of really changing that dialogue.
I'll end on this because I think it's the words that they chose to use on the White House chose to use: shifting liability for software products. That seems deliberate. And if what I hear in that is, if you sell me something that's vulnerable and it does something or gets broken into or whatever, I'm going to hold you accountable or you liable for that issue. Now, if software operated with not on a contiguous timeline, right? Meaning that there wasn't a new vulnerability found in a framework that was deployed 7 months ago and that software went live, cool. But that is not the reality we live in. So that, to me, that sounds like government saying, man, this security stuff is hard. Let's just blame the vendors and call it done. Maybe I'm wrong. Additionally, is, again, all of these policies, all of these statements, CMMC, and maybe I've just been through this enough times and I'm cynical now, but all I hear is blah, 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 more rhetoric, right? That we will do this. We will make this a priority. What the big consulting firms in DC here is cash register ringing, consultants. Let's hire another 1,000 consultants. Let's queue up buying the next 750 security products. And we'll have to implement all of them. And by the time they change out the government in another couple of years, this will all be invalid anyway, and somebody else will push their own agenda and we'll start over. And nothing actually gets better. That's the part that boils my blood. Is we make these broad, massive, sweeping statements on policy. And what you said, Jordan, is exactly the truth, right? We have this huge lift. And because we can't do little pieces at a time, the whole thing moves forward at an inch. Meanwhile, technology moves 80 miles an hour.
The only thing
it's not getting better.
The only thing I'll say to that is, I think a lot of that is right. I think in the shifting liability, though, to me, if you're a software provider to the government, this is where we get back to the efficacy around public-private partnerships, right? If you're a software provider to the government, you need to take ownership of what you're delivering, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Jordan and I wouldn't be on this show talking about cybersecurity, talking about identity, if we didn't believe exactly what Socure was going to be delivering to the government was going to solve problems. And at the end of the day, we also know that we stand behind the fact that if it's not getting to the outcomes that we wanted to have happen, that we take ownership of that, right? Because we stood in your office, we looked at you in the eye and said, this is what it's going to do. And I think all the government is doing is saying, if you say it's going to do X, it should do X, and it shouldn't have an asterisk next to it, right?
No, that's fair.
I think
And
that's
that's
all
fair.
it's saying. I'm a huge Jocko Willink fan. Take ownership of what you're delivering. I think that's all it's really saying.
Is
So
that
Yeah, okay, that's
Yeah,
fair.
and
does that
and I
change
don't
for
think,
SaaS versus like locally installed when you talk about software? Like SaaS, right? Like I control everything. You have no control. Like if I need to update, if I need to patch, I can do all that. Versus I give you Microsoft Word on your system, and then I say, wait a minute, there was a bug found in, some component we used, or even a vulnerability that we had we didn't catch first time around. Here's the patch. You don't apply it for 3 months, right? Like,
I think
so is there a difference
there's-
between SaaS and on-prem just from that perspective?
I would believe that there would be a difference in how they would interpret it. I mean, even today, right? If something goes wrong and it's the fault of the government, they're not going to go look at the vendor and say, you should have overridden what I did because I made a choice. That's just not reality there.
Mhm.
I think from the SaaS standpoint, and again, I don't think that they're going to be playing whack-a-mole related to vulnerabilities, because they all recognize, there's been many conversations in my former life, they recognize the thing evolves too quickly. What they will probably lean into is the fact that, like, let's say, pick on something, Log4j for an example. You had the ability as the company to patch something systemic within your system and do it within a reasonable time frame. We'll say a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something like that. And you decided 6 months later, you may start looking at it. That's a problem, right?
Mhm.
And unfortunately, that happens more often than not in a number of conversations in government.
Fair.
It's like, it's just was not important enough. And I think that is really what they're trying to close the loop on, just to be honest. Right?
Yeah,
Like, there's no reason a vulnerability that was discovered a year ago should be the thing that was exploited. It's a different thing when it's a 0 day that no one saw coming. Right? And I think that's the truth
fair.
here.
Jordan, that's fair. But how often? I think it's just as often the vendor not having the patch available as it's the patch sitting there waiting to be applied for months and months and months, if ever.
Depends on the solution. So I would agree that on the on-prem solution happens all the time. On the SaaS side, it actually happens quite a bit where there's something that could have been done and the decision calculus was not to. And then there was kind of this discovery piece where, like, the back door was left open for a period of time where it didn't need to be, right? Or there wasn't the right auditing in place internally, configuration management, for an example, to validate that there was a code change that took place which left something susceptible. And I think that, again, these are all nuanced conversations, but like that's I think the government is finally raising its hand to say enough is enough. Like we must kind of set a high bar standard comprehensively, because it's not just us, it's every other sector that I was talking about that's going to be impacted by these shortcomings. So let's just set the bar here. Let's drive everyone to it. We'll see how far we actually get. And then I'm sure in a couple of years, or a few years, we'll see a new iteration of this cybersecurity strategy where we set some new markers out there.
And
I
it brings it full circle on the public-private partnerships, right? I mean, you're either partner to government or you're not, and you have to make that decision. And it's not just saying, "Hey, I want to partner with government." It's all about your actions. It's all about what you're willing to do to prioritize their mission, right? Which is public service to citizens, Raph, like you and James. I mean, at the end of the day, it's putting your money where your mouth is all it is, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, okay, that's fair. Look, I think ultimately we'll see when rubber meets road, right? What this because right now it's very audacious. I think it's very aspirational. It's very comprehensive. Like it is the things that I would want to see changed.
Yeah.
Do we get traction out of this? Does anything meaningful happen as the time starts to tick away?
Two things to that, Raph, though, and I know we got to end. The very fact that it has things in there that you want to see changed, one, shows you that the leadership in place has that right vision, right? They see the things that are obvious and needs to be changed. The second is time will tell, right? I think at the end of the day, we'll know that there will be a scorecard, there will be a scoreboard to say, hey, you did it or you didn't. And that's when you have Jordan and I on again, and we'll say, hey, look, score was this. This is what happened.
Yeah.
Right.
And if you look at like history as a predictor, kind of what could happen in this space. Look, the last national cyber strategy was rolled out because again, behind the scenes, independent of political party, there's a lot of hardworking career officials who stay on across administrations. The things that they couldn't get done and they knew were way aspirational, they found opportunities to basically roll it over into this one, to basically say the focus is still there. There's still things we got to do. And then there's things they took off the list because they recognize either the landscape changed or they got it done. They may not have a party around it, but they were able to get some of these items in place. And so I would say, much to the point of government moves slow, it's kind of the reality there. It's intentional. And the reason why it moves slow is so that way it can kind of withstand what are the ebbs and flows of like market dynamics or what's happening with changing focus in particular. This kind of this more steady state. We're not getting kind of this knee-jerk reaction at all times, especially in IT and cybersecurity. And it's a benefit and a curse for those who want to go fast and do things really intact.
All right, final word here. I'll give you guys 1 minute each. Give me the following answer. And James, what the hell? Jump in too. On the record, as we look at these 5 things over the next 2 years, how much of this actually gets done?
Oh, you see, you're gonna. I'll jump in first. I would say, look, bolstering public-private partnerships gonna happen. I think the regulatory agenda, they're going to put out a number of things. We'll see how far they get within the next couple of years. I think on the spending and innovation front, honestly, the stars have to align. Right now, what I'm seeing in Congress is that they're not in terms of that. Even kind of the recent rollout of the president's budget and kind of the understanding, and it's understood in DC, the president's budget comes out. I used to work with the president's budget, and then immediately it gets thrown away by Congress, and they take their own approach to doing things. The hope is that they saw enough of what they want to accomplish in there. I think that is probably the big asterisk for me. And so the things that are within the executive branch's power to control, I think they'll be able to execute on fairly seamlessly. It's more the stuff that's going to require cross branch cooperation. That's going to be the harder things to accomplish.
A wise man once said, "It depends."
That is no. I'm not letting you get away with that. Get me an answer.
This is what I will say. Of all the times that legislation like this has been passed down, let's be clear, the executive order hasn't dropped yet, and we don't see all the specifics around it, but we have an idea. I have more confidence in the fact that there are, and I'm not just talking about the executive office, but I'm talking about some of the leadership in place to make some of this happen. We talked, I mean, for the umpteenth time, we're going to say mindset. Mindset has unequivocally changed in government, right? It doesn't mean that they're going to go at what our GM and SVP at Socure says, speed of excellence. Doesn't mean they're going to go super fast, but that's by design, right? What Jordan said is right. I mean, they have to be risk averse because what they do impacts our everyday life, right? But more than ever, I do have confidence in the people that are in place. And Raph, don't shake your head. I'm telling you, there are better people than myself, and that's not saying a lot, but there's better people than myself making smart decisions in government right now, and the landscape looks very different than it did a decade ago, 2 decades ago. So I have more confidence now than I did before.
That's a really long minute to say I'm not. I'm going to hedge my bet and say it depends. Hey, you're a lawyer. Get out of here.
I'm a podcast host, Raph. I can fill space.
All right, James. What do you think?
Well, listen, Raph, I remember us doing an interview a couple years ago at one of the conferences, and somebody telling us that our children would not drive in cars that they can actually drive. Well,
I think that was actually me that said that.
And I don't believe that. And
wrong.
Just like this, right? I mean, I think that getting down on paper what you want to do, I think can be done. I mean, we can put some stuff down. The implementation, like how much of that'll get done, I think, Brian said, right? That depends. I mean, it depends on the sector you're in. It depends on the organization that you are, all that stuff. Like how much can actually be accomplished? I mean, that's just going to depend. But
See?
being able to put down like, this is what we want to do, this is what we want to see. I mean, you know, we can write anything down, you know, heck, we've tried this. We'll list all the regulatory requirements you put out there in the past. You know, when we started the show, he said something about the top things we want you to fix. All I thought was OWASP top 10s that change every 3 years. Like, how's that going to work?
30 years?
Every 3 years, right? So
30 years?
You know, how's that work that by the time you actually get something laid out and people start implementing it, you're like, yeah, really the top things we need are going to change to this now. And now we have to go back to the drawing board. Like it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out.
All right, I'll give you guys my cynical take on this. I think the paper and the policy statement and all that, great. It will be well crafted. I believe we have the purest. I can be lulled into believing we have the purest intention with no lobbyist / vendor influence or little or some, maybe a lot. But I think ultimately, either partially because of the nature of mentally small-minded partisan politics, or simply because the speed of government is molasses in winter. You know, and that's it's part by design and part by dysfunction, and sometimes the two are the same thing. I think the answer is very little. I think they'll put some policy statements out. I think the shifting liability, particularly the shifting liability into promoting privacy and security of personal data, and promoting federal investments in new infrastructure and they're secure and resilient. Like those will be great ideas that we will put forth, and then they'll simply, I think they'll just they'll write off, float off into the sunset until the next one. I think the real things, the tangible things, like going after malware and ransomware. I think the partnerships with other governments, I think that's stuff we could actually implement, because it doesn't require us to fundamentally change the skeletal structure of our infrastructure and government. I think anything that requires us to change the mechanism of the way government IT functions is so calcified, so thoroughly compartmentalized and adversarial, and sometimes just from the outsider's perspective, so broken that making a unilateral change across everybody and expecting everybody to row at the same time in the same direction, I think I can get a fish to climb a tree faster. It's just not realistic. I don't know. It's not to say that it absolutely does not absolutely need to happen. I just, like, my cynical brain sees it and goes, not a snowball's chance in hell based on the evidence we've seen in the last 25 years. It just can't happen.
I can see that, and I'm not trying to take the closing statement. I have just seen more collaboration across government, more groups coming together. Jordan just sat in at the CIO Council just the other day, where top minds within government are coming together, trying to share kind of what they're seeing, what they're trying to do, trying to make things happen in aggregate, not in a silo, which is a big difference. I think, again, I'm not saying all of it's going to happen. I think that would be a pipe dream, but I think more is being done now than was before, and it gives me more hope that some of this is going to happen.
Well, in that case, here's the hope that some of this stuff actually happens, and we have a conversation in a couple of years where we're like, "Damn, we were all wrong, and this is awesome, and we have moved a mountain." Let's hope we get there.
And Raph, when we do, you're going to have a live rabbit sitting right behind you.
I had one. She's gone now. But yeah, I will dress up as a rabbit. Okay.
Perfect.
There you
How's
go.
that?
How do we make this happen? How do we contribute to this?
I'm gonna put a calendar invite in Raph's calendar. Get that going.
I've now changed all of my goals.
All right, guys, that's it. We gotta go. We're at the hour mark. But thanks for joining us. I mean, this is a fascinating discussion. I do hope things change, folks. Thanks for listening. If you've got an insider's or an outsider's opinion or some knowledge, feel free to share either on the Twitters at DtSR_podcast or on our LinkedIn page, where you'll find this conversation when it's posted. I'll tag Brian and Jordan, and they'll go see if you guys have any thoughts or want to speak your mind at all. And we'll see you guys another time.